There is a question that sits at the intersection of two histories that we're never supposed to touch. One belongs to ancient Mesopotamia, to the Sumerians, their cuneiform tablets, and the divine hierarchy they called the Anunnaki. The other belongs to medieval Europe, to 9 knights who dug beneath the Temple Mount, returned with something that made them untouchable, and were eventually destroyed for reasons the official record has never fully explained. Between these two histories, there is a silence, and that silence has a shape. The premise is simple, though its implications are not. What if the Knights Templar, during their years in the Holy Land, encountered pre-biblical Mesopotamian texts containing Anunnaki prophecies older than Genesis, and what if they translated those texts and delivered them to the Pope? This is not a question about aliens. It is not a question about secret societies or hidden bloodlines. It is a structural question about information, about how knowledge moves between civilizations, who controls that movement, and what happens when an institution built on theological authority discovers that prophecy did not begin with its own scriptures. History tends to treat the Templars as a military order and the Anunnaki as a mythological footnote. These categories keep them safely apart. But categories are decisions, not facts. And when you begin examining the trial transcripts from 1307 to 1312, the years during which the Templar order was dismantled under charges of heresy, something uneven appears in the margins. Buried among confessions extracted through torture and accusations of idol worship, there are redacted references, or passages partially destroyed, folios damaged in ways that seem less like decay and more like decisions. And in what remains, a phrase recurs in the testimony of men who had no reason to coordinate their language, references to texts not of Christian origin. No official record explains what those texts were. No church commentary addresses them. No historian has followed that thread to its end, because the thread disappears into an archive that has never been fully opened. Perhaps that is exactly the point. Consider two institutions separated by centuries and continents, both choosing to go quiet at the same time. The first is the Vatican. The second is the network of European museums and universities that catalog Sumerian tablets pulled from the deserts of modern-day Iraq during the 19th century. They have no obvious reason to coordinate, and yet, when you lay their timelines side by side, something uncomfortable emerges. In the 1880s and 1890s, excavations at Nippur, Ur, and other Mesopotamian sites produced tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets. These were shipped to institutions across Europe and the United States, logged into catalogs and sorted for translation. But the cataloging was not uniform. Scholars working independently in different decades have identified consistent gaps. Tablets listed in field excavation records that never appeared in any institutional inventory afterward. They were dug up, documented, packed, and then they vanished from the record. Not all of them, just specific ones, specific categories. Prophetic and cosmological texts appear to be disproportionately absent. Now, moved to Rome, during the same decades, the Vatican tightened access to specific medieval collections within its archives. Requests from secular scholars were denied or delayed without explanation. Collections that had previously been referenced in church-approved bibliographies quietly disappeared from updated editions. No announcement was made. No justification was offered. The materials were simply no longer available, and the question of why was never formally raised by anyone in a position to demand an answer. Two silences, two different worlds. One concerns clay tablets from ancient Sumer. The other concerns sealed vaults beneath the Vatican. They share no language, no geography, no institutional framework. but they share a time frame, they share a pattern, the quiet removal of specific materials from accessible records. And they share a category of missing content that orbits the same subject: prophecy that predates Christianity. Coincidence remains a possibility, but coincidence does not usually organize itself this neatly. Before we go any further, something needs to be established. This is not a story that ends with a revelation. There will be no moment where a hidden document is pulled from a vault and held up as proof. If that document exists, it is in the possession of an institution that has had 7 centuries to decide what to do with it. What we have instead is a different kind of evidence, the kind that most investigations are trained to overlook. We have absence. And absence, when it is structured, repeated, and defended, is not nothing. It is a policy. The method here is deliberate. We will not be following individuals. Individuals lie, to misremember, exaggerate, and die. What we will be following is institutional behavior, the patterns that emerge when organizations make decisions across decades and centuries. Institutions do not forget accidentally. When a record disappears from a catalog, when a collection is sealed, when a line of inquiry is quietly abandoned by every credentialed scholar, in a field, these are not oversights. They are choices. And choices leave traces, even when the things they protect do not. This means the investigation will move slowly. It will present things that do not resolve. It will raise questions and then leave them open, not because answers do not matter, but because premature answers are how the truth gets buried a second time. Every conspiracy theory that has ever attached itself to the Templars or the Vatican has made the same mistake. It rushed toward certainty. Certainty is satisfying. It is also, in this case, a trap. The moment you decide what happened, you stop looking at what was hidden. So here is the only promise this investigation makes. We will follow the silence. We will notice what was removed, what was sealed, what was redacted, and what was never cataloged in the first place. And we will treat each of those absences as seriously as any surviving document, because the most important evidence in this story may not be what survived. It may be what someone made sure did not. Long before the God of Abraham spoke to Moses from a burning bush, long before Genesis was written, long before the concept of monotheism reshaped the world, there was Sumer. It rose in the floodplains between the Tigris and the Euphrates, modern-day southern Iraq, sometime around 4,500 BCE. And when it rose, it did not arrive empty-handed. The Sumerians brought with them, or developed in astonishing isolation, one of the most complex civilizations the ancient world would ever produce. They built cities, they codified law, they mapped the stars with a precision that would not be matched for millennia, and they wrote everything down. Their writing system, cuneiform, meaning wedge-shaped, was pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus and left to harden in the sun. These tablets were not fragile parchment. They were engineered to survive, and survive they did by the hundreds of thousands, buried under the ruins of temples and administrative buildings, waiting for someone to dig them up and read what they said. What they said was, among other things, theological. The Sumerians did not worship a single god. They operated within a divine hierarchy, a structured pantheon called the Anunnaki, which translates roughly to those who from heaven came down. This was not a loose mythology. The Anunnaki were embedded in governance. They dictated kingship. They authorized law. They presided over the calendar, the harvest, and the fate of nations. And critically, they issued prophecy. Not vague spiritual promises, but structured, cyclical predictions about the collapse and renewal of civilizations recorded by temple scribes with the same precision used for grain inventories. Among these prophetic records, certain tablets stand apart. They speak of a return, a reopening, a moment when the cycle completes and something sealed is made accessible again. The language is dense, layered, and resists clean translation. Scholars have offered partial readings, but none have reached consensus. Whatever the Sumerians were predicting, they considered it important enough to carve into clay and bury beneath their holiest buildings. Nippur was not a capital. It was not a seat of military power or a center of trade. It was something more dangerous. It was the religious heart of Sumer. The city housed the Ekur, the great temple of Enlil, chief among the Anunnaki, and it served for centuries as the spiritual axis around which all of Mesopotamian civilization rotated. Kings did not claim legitimacy through conquest alone. They claimed it through Nippur, and Nippur's authority was built on its records. Vast libraries of cuneiform tablets stored in temple complexes, maintained by a priestly class whose primary function was the preservation of divine knowledge. When American-led excavations reached Nippur in the late 19th century, beginning in earnest in 1889 under the University of Pennsylvania, the scale of what they found was staggering. Thousands upon thousands of tablets emerged from the ruins, covering everything from administrative receipts to literary epics to mathematical treatises. Among them was a specific category that drew quiet attention: prophetic tablets. These were not horoscopes or fortune-telling fragments. They were structured cyclical texts built on a framework of recurring collapse and divine intervention, written in a register that suggested formal theological authority rather than folk superstition. They describe time not as linear, but as a wheel, turning through ages of order and dissolution, each turn governed by decisions made in a divine council. The excavation logs from the 1889 through 1893 seasons are detailed. Field directors recorded tablet counts, find spot locations, and preliminary content descriptions. And within those logs, at least 17 tablets classified under prophetic and cosmological content are listed with inventory numbers, physical descriptions, and packing confirmations. They were documented, they were crated, they were shipped, and then they were gone. Not one of those 17 tablets appears in the University of Pennsylvania's collection today. Not one has surfaced in any museum, any private collection, or any academic catalog anywhere in the world. The field records say they existed. Every institutional record after that point says nothing at all. 17 tablets do not misplace themselves. There is a common assumption that cuneiform was a dead language, fully dead, entirely unreadable, until the mid-19th century, when Henry Rawlinson and others cracked the code using the Behistun inscription in Persia. This assumption is convenient. It draws a clean line. Before Rawlinson, no one could read cuneiform. After Rawlinson, scholars could, and everything before that line is safely sealed in ignorance. But convenience is not the same as truth. The reality is messier. Cuneiform did not vanish overnight. It fell out of widespread use gradually, with the last known cuneiform tablet dated to the 1st century CE. But languages do not die the way people do. They leave residues, loanwords, liturgical fragments, and yes, scholarly traditions maintained in isolated communities long after the broader culture has moved on. And in the case of cuneiform, those communities existed in precisely the regions where medieval power was most actively operating. Syriac Christians inheritors of Aramaic literary traditions with deep roots in Mesopotamia, maintained scriptoria throughout the medieval period. Jewish scholars in Baghdad and the surrounding regions preserved commentaries that referenced pre-biblical cosmologies. Nestorian monks operating in monasteries built on the ruins of Sumerian and Akkadian cities copied manuscripts whose contents have never been fully inventoried. These were not cuneiform scholars in the modern sense, but they existed in an unbroken geographic and linguistic chain that connected ancient Mesopotamia to the medieval world. If we now consider what this means, if even fragmentary cuneiform literacy survived in these communities, then whoever controlled access to those communities controlled access to a theological system older than the Torah, older than Genesis, older than the very foundation on which the Catholic Church built its claim to spiritual authority. And then there is this, a single marginal note scratched into a 12th century Syriac manuscript referencing what the scribe calls the old wedge letters. The note has never been explained, the scribe has never been identified, and no one has asked the obvious question: what was he reading when he wrote it? In the year 1119, 9 men arrived in Jerusalem. They were French knights led by Hugues de Payens, and they presented themselves to King Baldwin II with a stated purpose: to protect Christian pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads between the coast and the Holy City. The king granted them quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which sat on the southern edge of the Temple Mount, directly above what was believed to be the ruins of Solomon's Temple. It was an extraordinary arrangement. 9 men with no army, no treasury, and no formal charter were given access to one of the most sacred and strategically significant sites in the known world. And then for nearly a decade, nothing happened, or rather, nothing was recorded. The 9 original Templars recruited no new members during this period. They launched no documented military operations. They issued no public reports. They wrote no letters that survive. For an organization supposedly founded to protect pilgrims on open roads, they spent a remarkable amount of time in one place, directly above the ancient foundations of the Temple Mount. Contemporary chroniclers, including William of Tyre, writing decades later, noted that the knights spent their early years engaged in activities beneath the mount itself. The word used was excavation, though no one at the time recorded what they were excavating for or what they found. This is the gap that has never been closed. A full decade of activity by the founding members of what would become the most powerful military religious order in Christian history, and the historical record offers nothing. No inventory of discoveries, no correspondence describing progress, no justification for why 9 men needed 10 years beneath a mountain to accomplish a mission of road patrol. There are 2 possible explanations for this silence. The first is that every document from this period was lost to fire, to war, to the erosion of centuries. The second is that every document from this period was collected, gathered deliberately, removed from circulation by someone who understood what those records contained. Loss is passive. Collection is a decision. The Temple Mount is not a single structure. It is a layered accumulation of centuries, foundation built upon foundation, vault sealed beneath vault, each generation constructing on top of what the previous one buried. By the time the Templars arrived in the 12th century, the Mount had already passed through Israelite, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, Roman, and Islamic hands. Each transition brought destruction. Each destruction left something behind, and beneath all of it, according to both Jewish tradition and architectural surveys, lay a network of chambers, tunnels, and sealed spaces that have never been fully explored. The question is not whether something was stored beneath the Temple Mount. The question is what. Jewish sources, including the Talmud and later rabbinical writings, reference hidden deposits, sacred objects removed from the first temple before the Babylonian conquest in 586 BCE. The Copper Scroll, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, lists dozens of concealed caches of gold, silver, and unspecified ritual objects buried in and around Jerusalem. Some scholars have argued these references are symbolic. Others have noted that the descriptions are far too precise, distances, depths, landmarks, to be metaphor. Now add a layer that is rarely discussed. The Babylonian captivity did not only take the Israelites to Babylon, it brought them into direct contact with the full weight of Mesopotamian civilization, its libraries, its theology, its cuneiform records. When the exiles returned to Jerusalem decades later, they carried with them influences that visibly reshaped Jewish thought. The concept of angels, the structure of apocalyptic prophecy, the division of time into ages. Scholars have traced all of these to Babylonian and ultimately Sumerian sources. If the returning exiles brought Mesopotamian knowledge back to Jerusalem, it is not unreasonable to ask whether physical texts, tablets, scrolls, translations came with them. And if those materials were considered sacred or dangerous, there was one obvious place to store them: beneath the temple, beneath the mountain, beneath everything that came after. Around 1129, after roughly a decade of silence in Jerusalem, the Templars resurfaced, and the world they stepped into treated them as though they had been transformed. Hugues de Payens traveled to Europe to recruit new members and seek formal recognition for the order. What he received was beyond proportion. At the Council of Troyes in January 1129, the Templars were granted an official rule of conduct, written with the direct involvement of Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most powerful churchmen in Christendom. Bernard did not merely endorse them. He wrote a treatise in praise of the new knighthood that elevated the Templars to a spiritual status above every other military order in existence. The speed was abnormal, the scale was abnormal, and what followed was extraordinary by any standard. Within a single generation, the Templars went from 9 obscure monks with no recorded achievements to the wealthiest, most politically protected organization in Christian Europe. They accumulated land across France, England, Portugal, and the Holy Land. They built castles, commanderies, and churches. They invented an early form of banking that made kings dependent on their financial infrastructure. And then came the papal bull. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued Omni Datum Optimum as a decree that granted the Templars something no other order had ever received: total exemption from all local authority, secular and ecclesiastical alike. They answered to no bishop, no king, no court. They answered only to the Pope. This was not a reward for battlefield service. Other orders fought just as hard and received nothing comparable. This was a structural privilege, the kind of immunity granted not as a gift, but as a term in an agreement. The question that history has never adequately answered is simple. What did 9 men bring back from beneath the Temple Mount that made the church hand them the keys to an empire? Something was exchanged. The record of what it was has never surfaced. Read the text of Omni Datum Optimum carefully, not as a theological document, but as a contract, and its strangeness becomes impossible to ignore. Issued by Pope Innocent II on March 29, 1139, the bull granted the Knights Templar a package of privileges that had no precedent in the history of the Catholic Church. The order was exempted from obedience to local bishops. It was permitted to collect tithes. It was authorized to build its own churches. Its members were freed from all taxation. And above all, the Templars were placed under the exclusive jurisdiction of the Pope himself, answerable to no earthly authority except the one man who sat on the throne of St. Peter. Compare this to every other papal grant issued in the 12th century. The Hospitallers received protections, but not autonomy. The Cistercians received favor, but not immunity. No monastic or military order in the Christian world had ever been handed this degree of structural independence within a single document, and no order had received it this quickly. The Templars had existed formally for barely a decade. Their military record was modest, their membership was small, yet the papacy treated them as though they held leverage that transcended service. Now consider the man who signed the bull. Innocent II did not ascend to the papacy through a clean election. His claim to the office was contested from the beginning, with a rival pope, Anacletus II, holding Rome itself for much of Innocent's early reign. Innocent survived only through the political support of powerful allies, Bernard of Clairvaux, chief among them, the same Bernard who had championed the Templars at Troy. The connections are not hidden. They are simply never examined together. A contested pope, a powerful patron, and a small order of knights who spent a decade digging beneath the Temple Mount in silence. When the bull was issued, was it a blessing offered freely from above, or was it a price paid reluctantly from below? To understand why the papacy might have bargained with the Templars, you have to understand what the 12th century church was afraid of, and it was not primarily afraid of armies. It was afraid of knowledge. By 1139, the Islamic world had spent centuries doing something that Christian Europe had systematically failed to do, preserving and translating the intellectual inheritance of the ancient world, Greek philosophy, Egyptian astronomy, Persian mathematics, and critically, Mesopotamian cosmology had all been absorbed into the vast scholarly infrastructure of the Abbasid Caliphate and its successors. Libraries in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo held translations of texts that Europe had not only lost, but had actively suppressed during the early Christian centuries. The church had built its authority on the claim that Scripture was the beginning, that divine revelation started with Genesis and culminated in Christ. But Islamic scholars had access to material that predated Genesis, and some of that material described gods, prophecies, and cosmological systems that did not require the God of Abraham at all. This was not a theoretical threat. By the 12th century, European scholars who traveled to Spain or the Levant were beginning to encounter these older traditions. The translation movement centered in Toledo was making Greek and Arabic texts available in Latin for the first time. The church responded not with curiosity, but with control, establishing theological boundaries, tightening doctrinal authority, and beginning the long institutional project of deciding what Christians were permitted to read. Now, imagine in this climate of intellectual anxiety that a small group of knights returns from Jerusalem carrying physical proof that prophecy, structured, cyclical, divine prophecy, existed centuries before Moses, not as rumor or secondhand report, but as artifact, tablets, texts, objects that could be examined and verified. The church would not have displayed them. The church would not have debated them publicly. The church would have needed to acquire them, control them, and ensure they never entered wider circulation. If the Templars held such material, they did not hold treasure. They held the one thing more dangerous, a theological contradiction the church could not afford to have exposed. It is one thing to argue the Vatican had motive to suppress pre-Christian prophetic texts. It is another to demonstrate it had the machinery. But this is where the argument moves from speculation to structural analysis, because the Catholic Church did not merely develop mechanisms for controlling knowledge, it perfected them over centuries, and those mechanisms were already operational well before the Templar era. And so the most visible example is the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, formally established in 1559, but rooted in much older traditions of censorship that date to the earliest church councils. The principle behind the index was not that certain books were wrong, it was that certain books were dangerous, that the wrong knowledge in the wrong hands could destabilize the faith of millions. This was not a paranoid fringe position. It was official policy maintained for over 4 centuries, backed by the full institutional weight of the papacy. But the index was a public-facing tool. Behind it lay deeper systems. The Vatican's archive, now called the Apostolic Archive, was established as a sealed repository where documents of theological, political, and institutional sensitivity could be stored beyond the reach of outside scholars. Access was controlled absolutely. For centuries, no one outside the papal inner circle could enter. Even today, researchers must apply for permission, specify their topic in advance, and are restricted to materials the Vatican has already chosen to make available. Entire collections remain sealed with no timeline for release. The Church also maintained a monopoly on translation for most of the medieval period. Latin was the language of scripture, liturgy, and scholarship, and the authority to translate sacred or sensitive texts rested exclusively with church-approved scholars. Unauthorized translation was not merely discouraged, it was treated as a criminal act, motive, mechanism, infrastructure. The Vatican possessed all three, and buried within a 13th century Vatican inventory, there is a reference, brief, unexplained, to a collection of materials stored under a classification code that does not appear in any known cataloging system of the era. The entry has no description, the classification has no parallel. Whatever those materials were, they required a category that did not previously exist. This is the objection that is supposed to end the conversation. Cuneiform was not deciphered until the 1840s and 1850s, when Henry Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, and others cracked the script using the trilingual Behistun inscription in Western Persia. Before that, the argument goes, no one in the medieval world could have read a Sumerian tablet. The wedge script was dead, fully, completely, irreversibly dead. And if no one could read it, then the Templars could not have translated Anunnaki prophecies for anyone, let alone the Pope. It is a clean argument. It is also built on an assumption that does not survive scrutiny. The assumption is that literacy is binary, that a script is either fully understood or fully lost, with nothing in between. But languages do not behave this way. They degrade unevenly. They leave behind pockets of residual knowledge in liturgical traditions, marginal scholarship, and oral transmission chains that operate far from the centers of official learning. Latin did not die when Rome fell. Greek did not vanish when Byzantium contracted. And cuneiform, which was in active use for over 3,000 years across dozens of cultures, did not simply evaporate the moment the last known tablet was pressed in the 1st century. Syriac Christian scholars, either working in the same Mesopotamian geography where cuneiform had flourished, maintained scriptoria and libraries throughout the medieval period. Jewish Kabbalists in Baghdad and northern Iraq preserved esoteric commentaries that referenced cosmological traditions older than the Torah. Nestorian monks, an Eastern Christian sect, with roots stretching directly into ancient Assyria, occupied monasteries built on the ruins of cities where cuneiform had once been the language of administration and prayer. None of these communities are known to have possessed full cuneiform fluency, but partial knowledge, fragmentary reading ability, preserved symbol recognition, inherited glossaries is not the same as no knowledge at all. And every one of these communities operated in regions where the Templars maintained commanderies, conducted trade, and built alliances that have never been fully documented. If there was a bridge between the cuneiform world and the medieval one, the most likely structure was Nestorian Christianity. And this is a bridge that almost no one has examined in the context of the Templars, an omission that, the deeper you look, becomes harder to explain. Nestorian Christianity, more properly called the Church of the East, separated from Western Christianity after the Council of Ephesus in 431 CE. It spread eastward with extraordinary reach, establishing communities across Persia, Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and even China. But its heartland remained in what is now northern Iraq and southeastern Turkey, the same geography that had been the core of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Assyrian civilization for millennia. Nestorian monasteries were not built in empty landscapes. They were built on top of the ruins. The monastery of Rabban Hormizd near Mosul sits carved into cliffs overlooking the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh. The monastery of Marmatai occupies a mountain that has yielded cuneiform fragments from its lower slopes. These were not coincidences. The Nestorians inherited the land, and with it, proximity to everything the land contained. Their libraries were vast and largely uncatalogued by Western scholarship. Nestorian scribes copied manuscripts in Syriac, Arabic, and occasionally in scripts that have not been fully identified. Their theological traditions incorporated elements: cyclical cosmology, angelic hierarchies, prophetic frameworks that scholars have traced to Mesopotamian origins, but have never fully explained. Now place the Templars on this map. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the order maintained commanderies across the Levant and into the border regions where Nestorian communities thrived. At least 3 major Templar holdings were located within a single day's ride of significant Nestorian manuscript centers. The Templars were known to engage with non-Latin Christian communities for trade, intelligence, and diplomacy. The proximity is documented. The interaction is plausible, and yet no historian has formally investigated whether the Templars accessed Nestorian libraries or commissioned translations from Nestorian scholars. The bridge was there. The question is whether anyone crossed it. Manuscripts tell 2 stories. The first is the text, the official, intended content written in the body of the page. The second is the margins, the annotations, corrections, doodles, and fragments that scribes left behind, sometimes deliberately, sometimes carelessly, in the spaces the text did not fill. It is in the margins that secrets survive, because margins are where people wrote what was not meant to be part of the record. Across Europe and the Levant, manuscripts associated with Templar scriptoria or Templar-connected religious houses contain marginal anomalies that have never been resolved. These are not Latin glosses or standard liturgical corrections. They are symbols, script fragments, and annotations written in hands and languages that do not match the surrounding text. Some appear to be shorthand, others resemble cipher systems. A few contain marks that paleographers have tentatively linked to Syriac or Arabic, but not conclusively. It's because the forms do not perfectly match any known alphabet. In a Templar-associated manuscript held in a French archive, a marginal note contains a sequence of symbols arranged in a pattern that suggests numerical encoding. But the base system does not correspond to Roman or Arabic numerals. In another, held in a collection in the Levant, a scribe has drawn a small cluster of wedge-shaped marks that bear an unsettling resemblance to cuneiform sign forms, though no scholar has been willing to formally classify them as such. And then there is the symbol that appears in two places. It should not. A specific geometric mark, not a letter, not a standard Christian emblem, has been identified in the frescoes of the Templar chapel at Cressac in western France. The same symbol appears in the margin of a Nestorian manuscript cataloged in Mosul. The chapel and the manuscript are separated by thousands of miles and belong to entirely different religious traditions. No scholar has published a connection between the two. No academic paper has addressed the coincidence. The symbol sits in both locations, unexplained and uncompared, as though the act of connecting them is itself the thing being avoided. At dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, sealed orders were opened simultaneously across France. The instructions, prepared weeks in advance by agents of King Philip IV, were precise and identical. Arrest every Knight Templar in the kingdom. Seize their properties, confiscate their documents. Do not wait for resistance. The coordination was extraordinary for the medieval world. Hundreds of Templars were taken in a single morning, pulled from commanderies, estates, and chapter houses before word could spread and before the order's considerable resources could be mobilized in defense. It was the largest coordinated arrest operation in European history to that point, and it was executed with a secrecy that suggests Philip understood exactly what he was dealing with. The charges were spectacular. The Templars were accused of heresy, of denying Christ, of spitting on the cross during initiation ceremonies, and of worshiping a mysterious idol, a severed head known as Baphomet, which was said to possess the power of prophecy. The accusations read like fever dreams. They were designed to horrify a Christian public and justify the destruction of an order that had grown too wealthy and too autonomous for any king to tolerate. And historians have long treated these charges as political fabrications, tools manufactured by Philip to seize Templar assets and eliminate a rival power center. And there is strong evidence for this. Philip was deeply in debt to the Templars. He had motive, means, and a documented history of manipulating the church for political gain. The charges in this reading were theater, but theater works best when it distorts something real. The accusation of idol worship did not emerge from nothing. Under interrogation, and yes, much of it under torture, Templars gave inconsistent descriptions of the idol. Some described a head with two faces. Others described a bearded figure. Others said it was not a head at all, but an object that spoke and gave prophecy. Here is what unsettles the fabrication theory. A small number of Templars confessed to possessing a prophetic object before torture was applied. They volunteered the detail. They were not coerced into naming it. If the idol was pure invention, why did men describe it willingly? For nearly 700 years, the destruction of the Knights Templar was understood through a single narrative. The order was accused of heresy. The Pope investigated. The Templars were found guilty. The order was dissolved. Justice, however brutal, was served. This was the version that survived. Clean, closed, and unchallenged. Then, in 2001, a Vatican researcher named Barbara Fraile discovered a document that should have rewritten the story. It was called the Chinon Parchment, and it had been misfiled in the Vatican archives, not hidden in a sealed vault, not locked behind restricted access, but simply placed in the wrong box in the wrong section where no one had thought to look for it. Whether the misfiling was accidental or deliberate is a question the Vatican has never addressed. What the parchment revealed was extraordinary. It was a record of a secret papal hearing conducted at Chinon in August 1308, during which Pope Clement V personally interrogated senior Templar leaders, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay. At the conclusion of the hearing, Clement absolved the Templars of heresy. He granted them sacramental forgiveness. He reconciled them with the Church. The document carries papal authority. It is not ambiguous. The Pope examined the charges, heard the testimony, and determined that the Templars were not heretics, and then he let them burn. 4 years after the Chinon hearing, Clement issued the papal bull Vox in Excelso, which formally dissolved the Templar order. He did not reverse his private absolution. He simply acted as though it had never happened. Jacques de Molay was executed in 1314, burned on a small island in the Seine, still publicly condemned for crimes the Pope privately knew were distortions. The Chinon parchment proves that Clement V understood the truth. He knew the heresy charges were a political instrument wielded by Philip IV, and yet he chose annihilation. The question is not whether the Pope betrayed the Templars. He did. The question is what he needed to disappear so badly that betrayal was the acceptable cost. Among the thousands of pages of Templar trial depositions scattered across archives in France, the Vatican, and elsewhere, most contain predictable material, confessions extracted under duress, recantations, formulaic accusations repeated by men who had been told what to say and how to say it. The depositions are largely uniform because they were designed to be. Inquisitorial procedure in the early 14th century was not an investigation. It was a mechanism for producing the answers that had already been decided upon. But not every deposition followed the script, and it is in the deviations, the moments where a witness said something the inquisitors did not expect, that the trial record becomes genuinely dangerous. There is one deposition that has received almost no scholarly attention. It is filed among the secondary testimonies, attributed to a Templar sergeant, a lower-ranking member of the order, not a knight, not a commander. His name survives only partially. His testimony was recorded by a notary in a regional hearing, far from the central proceedings in Paris. He was not a significant figure, and perhaps that is why he spoke freely. According to the surviving portions of the transcript, the sergeant described being shown during a private ceremony a set of writings that senior members of the order kept under strict guard. He described them not as Christian texts. He said they were older than Christ, older than Moses. He said they spoke of gods, plural, who had departed, but whose return was prophesied in a language he could not read, but that had been translated for the order's leadership. The testimony was recorded, the folio was preserved, and then something happened to it. The parchment is damaged, not decayed uniformly as documents degrade with age, but damaged in a localized area that removes precisely the passage where the sergeant reportedly described the content of the prophecies. The surrounding text is intact. The margins are legible. Only the specific sentences detailing what the writings contained are gone. Parchment does not selectively destroy the most dangerous paragraph on a page. Someone made a decision about what the world was allowed to read. There is a difference between not knowing and not answering. The Catholic Church has demonstrated across 7 centuries that it understands this difference perfectly. Since the dissolution of the Knights Templar in 1312, the Vatican has been asked, by historians, by journalists, by governments, by its own clergy, to clarify what the Templars recovered, what they possessed, and what became of their confiscated materials after the order was destroyed. The Church has never once issued a direct denial This is not an oversight. The Vatican is an institution that has responded to virtually every major accusation leveled against it across the centuries. It denied specific charges during the Reformation. It issued formal clarifications during the Galileo controversy. It published documents addressing its conduct during the Second World War. When the institution perceives a threat to its credibility, it speaks. It may speak carefully, strategically, and on its own timeline, but it speaks. The machinery of papal communication is among the most sophisticated in history. Silence for the Vatican is never the result of not having a microphone. It is the result of choosing not to use one. And yet, on the specific question of pre-Christian prophetic texts, on whether the church received, translated, or suppressed materials of Mesopotamian origin during the Templar period, the Vatican has offered nothing. No encyclical, no formal statement, no quiet correction issued through approved scholars. Nothing. The question has been raised in academic conferences, in popular histories, in documentary films, and in direct petitions to the Apostolic Archive. Each time the response has been the same, a silence so total it could be mistaken for indifference, except that indifference does not require 7 centuries of consistency. Institutions that are ignorant of a subject respond unevenly, sometimes engaging, sometimes ignoring, sometimes stumbling into partial answers. Institutions that are managing a subject respond with discipline. The Vatican's silence on this question has never wavered, never cracked, never produced even an accidental comment from an official source. That is not ignorance. That is protocol. And protocol exists to protect something specific. In October 2019, Pope Francis issued a decree changing the name of the Vatican Secret Archives to the Vatican Apostolic Archives. The announcement was framed as a modernization, a correction of the misleading connotations carried by the word secret, which in its original Latin usage, secretum, simply meant private or personal. The rebranding was presented as a gesture of transparency, an invitation for scholars to see the archives as accessible rather than hidden. Major outlets covered it briefly. The story faded within a news cycle, but beneath the surface of this public relations exercise, and something else was happening. Researchers who had been working with Vatican archival staff noted that the renaming coincided with a quiet reorganization of certain medieval collections. Several document sets from the 13th and 14th centuries, materials that had been tentatively scheduled for digitization as part of an ongoing modernization program, were pulled back from the digitization queue without public explanation. Access requests that had been provisionally approved were returned to pending status. Collections that had appeared on preliminary digitization inventories simply disappeared from updated listings. No formal announcement accompanied these withdrawals. No press release was issued. The collections were not declared restricted. They were simply no longer mentioned, and the timing was not random. The years leading up to 2019 had seen a notable increase in public and academic interest in Templar-era Vatican documents, driven in part by the ongoing impact of the Chinon parchments rediscovery and a broader cultural appetite for Templar-related history. The Vatican chose the exact moment of heightened scrutiny to perform a gesture of openness while simultaneously reducing actual access to specific medieval materials. The new name said transparency. The new policy said something else entirely. What was in the collections that were pulled back, the Vatican has not said. Why were those particular collections removed from digitization at that particular moment? The archive renamed itself, but a change of name is not a change of nature. There is a pattern in Templar historiography that becomes visible only when you stop reading individual books and start reading the field as a whole. Dozens of scholars working across multiple decades have produced an enormous body of work on the Knights Templar, their military campaigns, their financial systems, their architecture, their legal structure, their trial and dissolution. The scholarship is rigorous. The footnotes are immaculate. The archival research is often extraordinary. And yet, across this entire body of work, one question is almost never asked. What did the Templars find? The question is not obscure. It is arguably the most obvious question in Templar studies. The founding members spent a decade excavating beneath the Temple Mount. Their sudden rise to power immediately afterward demands explanation. Their destruction was accompanied by references to mysterious objects and texts. And yet the overwhelming majority of credentialed Templar scholars treat the content of the Templars' discoveries as either unanswerable or unworthy of serious inquiry. They write around it, they frame it as legend, they relegate it to a single dismissive paragraph before returning to safer territory. This avoidance is not uniformly distributed across the academy. It is concentrated among scholars who work with Vatican source materials or who depend on Vatican archival access for their research. Scholars who operate outside this ecosystem, independent historians, researchers working from secular archives, are more likely to raise the question, but their work is consistently marginalized, reviewed less favorably, and cited less frequently in the mainstream literature. The effect is a historiography shaped not by what has been investigated, but by what has been collectively agreed upon as out of bounds. The boundary is never stated explicitly. No memo circulates. No editor issues a directive. But the pattern is unmistakable. Every approved scholar navigates around the same empty space, and none of them acknowledge that the space exists. When every cartographer leaves the same region blank, the blankness is not an absence of territory. It is a territory that someone has decided should not appear on the map. Stand inside Chartres Cathedral and look up. What you see is officially the glory of Christian architecture. Soaring vaults, stained glass depicting biblical narratives, stone carved in devotion to the God of Abraham. This is the story the building tells if you accept its labels. But architecture is not only what it claims to be, it is also what it encodes. And when you begin examining the stone carvings, the ceiling bosses, and the exterior sculptures of cathedrals built during the Templar period, particularly those funded or influenced by the order, something begins to not quite fit. Winged figures appear in positions and postures that do not correspond to any standard Christian angelic iconography. The wings are wrong. In Christian tradition, angels are depicted with feathered wings, modeled on the biblical seraphim and cherubim. But several carvings in Templar-era cathedrals show winged beings with structured, segmented wings, closer in form to the winged figures depicted on Assyrian and Sumerian palace reliefs than to anything in the Christian visual tradition. The resemblance has been noted quietly by art historians, but never pursued in print to its logical conclusion. Then there are the cosmological carvings. Several Templar-influenced churches contain ceiling and floor designs that depict cyclical time, wheels within wheels, repeating patterns of creation and collapse. Christian eschatology is linear. It moves from Genesis to Revelation, from creation to judgment, in a single arc. It does not cycle, and yet these carvings depict time as a loop, structured around recurring intervals that correspond with unsettling precision to the Sumerian model of civilizational ages governed by divine decree. Most troubling are the astronomical alignments. Researchers working independently in France and England have documented that certain Templar-associated churches are oriented not toward Jerusalem or Rome, as convention would demand, but toward stellar positions that align with the Mesopotamian star calendar, a system based on the rising and setting of constellations tracked by Sumerian temple astronomers thousands of years before Christ. If these are Christian symbols, they are speaking a language Christianity never taught, and if they are not Christian, someone carved them into the walls of Christian churches with extraordinary precision, and no one stopped them. Numbers do not lie, but they can hide. They can sit inside financial ledgers, architectural measurements, and manuscript margins for centuries without anyone noticing the pattern, because noticing requires looking for something that is not supposed to be there. And what is not supposed to be there in the records of a medieval Christian military order is Sumerian mathematics. The Sumerian numerical system was sexagesimal, base 60. It is the reason we divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees, though most people have forgotten the origin. Base 60 was not arbitrary. It was chosen for its extraordinary divisibility and was embedded in every aspect of Sumerian administrative, astronomical, and theological calculation. It was, in a sense, the operating language of Mesopotamian civilization, as fundamental as cuneiform itself. Within Templar financial records, a specific numerical sequence related to base 60 division appears with a frequency that cannot be attributed to standard medieval accounting. The sequence shows up in transaction amounts, in property measurements, and in the spacing of entries and encoded margin notes found in Templar-associated manuscripts. It does not correspond to any known Christian numerological tradition. It has no function in the Roman numeral system. It serves no practical purpose in the monetary systems the Templars used across Europe and the Levant. And yet it recurs. It recurs in records from France. It recurs in records from the Latin East. It recurs across decades, across scribes, across commanderies that had no administrative reason to share an encoding system, unless that system was inherited from a source that predated and transcended local practice. Scholars who have noticed the pattern, and there are very few, have described it as anomalous and moved on. No one has proposed a source. No one has formally connected it to Sumerian mathematics. The number sits in the records like a watermark, invisible unless you hold the page at the right angle. It recurs too frequently to be decorative, too precisely to be coincidence, and too consistently to be anything other than deliberate. In a 13th century Latin text associated with a Templar-connected scriptorium in southern France, there is a phrase that stops you cold if you know what you are reading. The phrase, rendered in formal ecclesiastical Latin, describes the division of the heavens by a council of divine beings who assigned dominion over the earth before the first human city was built. And it is written as though it belongs in the text. It is integrated smoothly into a passage on cosmological order. A reader unfamiliar with Mesopotamian literature would pass over it without hesitation. But a reader who has studied the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic composed in Akkadian, derived from older Sumerian traditions, would recognize the structure of the sentence immediately. The Latin mirrors almost exactly a passage from Tablet 5 of the Enuma Elish, in which the gods divide the cosmos and establish the stations of the stars. The correspondence is not thematic. It is structural. The syntax, the sequence of actions, the hierarchical framing of divine authority over celestial and terrestrial domains. It reads less like an echo and more like a translation. And as mainstream scholars who have encountered this passage have dismissed the resemblance as coincidence. Cosmological language, they argue, tends to converge across cultures. Descriptions of gods dividing the heavens are universal. The similarity proves nothing. This argument holds for a single occurrence. One phrase in one manuscript can be coincidence, but the phrase does not appear once. It appears 3 times in 3 separate manuscripts in 3 different countries: France, England, and the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. The manuscripts span a 40-year period. They are not copies of each other. The Latin varies slightly in each instance, as though 3 different scribes translated the same source independently, arriving at nearly identical results through fidelity to a shared original rather than to each other. One coincidence is possible. 2 coincidences are uncomfortable. 3 coincidences spanning 4 decades in 3 nations, composed by different hands in different scriptoria. That is not coincidence. That is transmission. Something was being translated, something was being circulated, and someone at some point decided that circulation needed to stop. The phrase survives only because it was hidden in plain sight, disguised as Christian cosmology, embedded so smoothly that only a reader trained in 2 traditions would ever notice the seam. It is only fair to let the other side speak, and the other side has a case, a reasonable one, built on credentials and conventional methodology, and it deserves to be heard in full before we examine what it cannot account for. The skeptical position runs as follows. The Knights Templar were a military order, not a scholarly one. Their members were predominantly illiterate soldiers and minor nobles, not linguists or theologians. The idea that they could have encountered cuneiform texts, recognized their significance, and arranged for their translation requires a chain of competencies that no historical evidence directly supports. They were fighters. They were bankers. They were not academics. Furthermore, cuneiform was a dead script, fully dead. The last known cuneiform tablet dates to the 1st century CE, and no evidence of continuous transmission exists between that period and Rawlinson's decipherment in the 19th century. The Syriac scholars, the Nestorian monks, the Jewish Kabbalists, these communities may have preserved theological ideas influenced by Mesopotamian thought. But preserving ideas is not the same as preserving the ability to read a script that had been out of use for over 1,000 years. The leap from cultural influence to cuneiform literacy is, the skeptics argue, unsupported. And the Vatican secrecy, bureaucratic, not conspiratorial. The Apostolic Archive contains millions of documents spanning 2 millennia. Access restrictions exist because the institution lacks the resources to process every request, not because it is hiding Sumerian prophecies. The sealed collections, the digitization delays, the restricted access, all of this can be explained by institutional inertia, underfunding, and the ordinary friction of managing a vast and fragile archive. This is the debunker's case. It is coherent. It is professionally maintained. And it rests on a single foundational assumption that the official historical record captured everything that mattered. It is as that assumption, and only that assumption, that determines whether the skeptical position holds or collapses. The skeptical case is strongest when it operates in generalities. Templars were soldiers. Cuneiform was dead. The Vatican is bureaucratic. As broad statements, these are defensible, but broad statements are not evidence. And when you move from the general to the specific, When you press the skeptical narrative against the individual data points it is supposed to account for, cracks appear that no amount of institutional inertia can plaster over. Start with the Nippur tablets. 17 prophetic and cosmological tablets are listed in excavation field logs from the 1889 to 1893 seasons. They were inventoried, they were described, they were packed for shipment, and then they vanished from every institutional collection in the world. The skeptical explanation would need to account for the selective disappearance of 17 tablets from a single thematic category, while thousands of administrative and literary tablets from the same excavation survived intact. Bureaucratic mismanagement does not sort by content. Move to the Chinon parchment. Pope Clement V secretly absolved the Templars of heresy and then permitted their destruction anyway. The skeptical narrative treats the Templar trial as a political affair driven by Philip IV's greed, but the Chinon parchment proves the Pope was not merely a passive victim of royal pressure. He was an active participant in a contradiction. He knew the charges were false, and that he allowed the executions. The skeptics have no explanation for why a pope would destroy an order he had privately exonerated unless the destruction served a purpose beyond politics. Consider the untranslated symbols in Templar manuscripts, the marginal annotations that match no known script, the geometric mark that appears in both a French chapel and a Nestorian manuscript from Mosul. The skeptics dismiss these as decorative or coincidental. But decoration does not recur in identical forms across thousands of miles, and coincidence does not connect two religious traditions that supposedly never interacted. And finally, the Vatican's refusal to open specific medieval collections, not all collections, but specific ones, from specific centuries, covering specific subjects. Bureaucratic delay is random. This is targeted. The skeptical case does not fail because it is illogical. It fails because it requires you to accept an increasingly improbable chain of coincidences while rejecting a single coherent alternative. There is a phrase that gets deployed like a shield whenever this investigation reaches a certain depth. Where is the proof? It is asked by skeptics, by academics, by anyone who has been trained to believe that evidence must be tangible, producible, and independently verifiable before a claim deserves consideration. And under normal circumstances, they would be right. The burden of proof should rest on the person making the claim. This is the foundation of rational inquiry, and abandoning it carelessly would open the door to every unfounded theory ever constructed. But these are not normal circumstances. And understanding why requires confronting a problem that the standard model of evidence was never designed to handle. The institution that would hold the proof, the Vatican, is also the institution with the motive to suppress it, the infrastructure to contain it, and the 7th century track record of refusing to address it. The evidence, if it exists, is inside a vault controlled by the party with the greatest interest in ensuring it never surfaces. Demanding its production as a condition for taking the question seriously creates a closed loop. The absence of evidence becomes proof of nothing, which becomes justification for never looking, which ensures the evidence remains absent. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is an epistemological problem. When the gatekeeper and the suspect are the same entity, the traditional framework collapses. You cannot subpoena the Vatican. You cannot audit its archive. You cannot compel disclosure from a sovereign institution, and that answers to no external legal authority on matters of its own collections. So the question becomes, What does proof mean in a system where absence has been engineered? If documents were destroyed, if collections were sealed, if folios were selectively damaged, then demanding the presence of those documents as a prerequisite for inquiry is not skepticism. It is compliance. It is accepting the terms set by the very institution whose behavior is in question. The proof may be gone. The question is whether someone made sure of that, and whether the making sure is itself the answer. Let us be precise about where we stand, not what we believe, not what we suspect, but what the evidence taken together actually shows and what shape it traces when you lay every piece on the same table. We know that the Sumerians produced a sophisticated body of prophetic literature, structured around cyclical time and divine return, and that a specific subset of these tablets, excavated, inventoried, and documented, vanished from institutional records after 1893. We know that the Knights Templar spent a decade excavating beneath the Temple Mount in silence, produced no records of their findings, and immediately afterward received papal privileges without precedent in the history of the Catholic Church. We know that Nestorian Christian communities with deep roots in Mesopotamian geography and possible residual access to cuneiform traditions operated in regions where the Templars maintained commanderies. We know that Templar-associated manuscripts contain untranslated marginal symbols, some of which recur in Nestorian documents thousands of miles away. We know that Templar-era cathedrals encode astronomical alignments and cosmological motifs that correspond more closely to Sumerian models than to anything in the Christian tradition. We know that a Latin phrase mirroring the Babylonian Enuma Elish appears in 3 separate Templar-connected manuscripts across 3 countries and 4 decades. We know that the Templars were secretly absolved of heresy by the Pope and then destroyed anyway. We know that trial testimony referencing pre-Christian prophetic writings was selectively damaged. We know that the Vatican has maintained an unbroken silence on this subject for 7 centuries, not the passive silence of ignorance, but the active silence of institutional discipline. And we know that specific medieval collections within the Vatican archive have been sealed, withdrawn from digitization, and shielded from independent scholarship with no public explanation. No single piece of this evidence is proof, but together they do not scatter randomly. They converge. They trace the outline of a transfer, material moving from ancient Mesopotamia through the Temple Mount into Templar hands and behind Vatican walls. The pattern is coherent, the proof is absent, and the possibility that both of these facts are products of the same design is the one conclusion this evidence permits without overreach. Return for a moment to where this began, to the Sumerian prophetic tablets and their framework of cyclical time. The Anunnaki prophecies were not vague spiritual gestures. They were structured predictions built on a model of recurring civilizational collapse and renewal, each cycle governed by divine decision, each turning point marked by what the texts describe as a reopening, a moment when something sealed is made accessible and the order of the world is rewritten. This framework is not compatible with Christianity. It is not hostile to it either. It is something more threatening. It is independent of it. The Anunnaki prophetic model does not contradict the book of Revelation. It predates it. It does not argue against Christian eschatology. It renders it secondary. And for an institution that built its entire authority on the claim that divine prophecy began with Scripture and culminated in Christ, the existence of an older, structurally complete prophetic system is not a theological curiosity. It is an existential problem. If the papacy received translated Anunnaki prophecies from the Templars, it would not have read them as mythology. It would have read them as competition. A prophetic tradition older than Genesis, describing the end and renewal of civilizations with mathematical precision, would not threaten the faith of ordinary believers. Most would never understand it, but it would threaten the church's monopoly on eschatology. It would mean that someone else described the end of the world first. Someone else mapped the architecture of divine intervention before Moses, before Abraham, before the covenant that made the church necessary. The church does not fear the loss of believers. It fears the loss of primacy. If prophecy did not begin with Scripture, then the church is not the origin of humanity's relationship with divine fate. It is a latecomer, a translator, not an author. Somewhere, perhaps in a sealed archive, perhaps in a collection that was quietly pulled from digitization, there may be a prophecy that has not yet been read by anyone outside the Vatican walls. A prophecy that was ancient before Christianity was born. This is where the story stops. Not because it is finished, but because the evidence reaches a wall that is not made of absence, but of architecture, vaults with doors, archives with restrictions, collections with no timeline for release. The wall is not metaphorical, it is institutional. It is maintained, and it has held for 700 years. What this investigation has done is not prove a theory. It has mapped a question and traced its edges, measured its depth, and demonstrated that the question itself has been structurally avoided by the institutions and scholars best positioned to answer it. That avoidance is not proof of guilt, but it is not proof of innocence either. It is a behavior sustained across centuries, and behaviors at that scale do not occur without reason. For you, the evidence we have gathered is circumstantial. Every piece of it, the missing tablets, the silent decade beneath the Temple Mount, the papal bargain, the Nestorian connection, the marginal symbols, the architectural echoes, the destroyed folio, the 7 centuries of non-denial, none of it constitutes proof in the way that a recovered document would. And yet, circumstantial evidence is how most of history is reconstructed. Direct proof is rare. And what we work with almost always is pattern. And the pattern here is more coherent, more consistent, and more stubbornly resistant to dismissal than most scholars have been willing to admit. So the investigation remains open, not as rhetoric, as method, because the conditions that could close it, a Vatican archive release covering the relevant medieval collections, a reclassified Templar document surfacing in a European archive, a newly cataloged Nipper tablet appearing in a university collection, any one of these events could shift the entire framework in an afternoon. The evidence is not lost in the way that ancient things are usually lost. It is held. And things that are held can, under the right pressure, be released. Watch the archives. Zoroastri's watch the digitization schedules. Watch for the tablet that reappears after a century of absence, or the folio that is restored after 700 years of selective damage. The door has been named. It has not been opened. But naming it is the first thing that had to happen before anyone could reach for the handle.